Well, welcome to Kalindi Vora and Neda Atanasoski, who are the co-conveners of the group on post-socialisms and imperial legacies. I think I flipped the title. So it's a pleasure to have you here and to engage in this conversation with us. I was just thinking that you might speak a little bit about the work of the group, what the theme is about, what areas you're covering, what kinds of ideas you're playing with.
Sure. Maybe I can start by giving you a sense of how we came to the topic of the group. So the title is actually Imperial Legacies and Post-Socialist Contexts. And this was a sort of formulation of a problem that came to us together about 5 years ago when we first met as postdoctoral fellows. And we were interested in how, though Neda was looking at Eastern Europe and I was looking at India as our sites of interest, we were running into many of the same sort of material and theoretical questions. And even more interesting than that, our similar training in post-colonial theory, critical race and gender studies, and also cultural studies led us to find not only some of the same kind of points of interest in our work, but also some of the same problems. And eventually, the limits of the frameworks that we had available for thinking about our sites of interest, cultural production in different ways, became formulated through this collaboration as involving a commonality between post-colonial sites mapped in a sort of geographic imaginary as post-colonial, and sites the same as post-socialist. And so in bringing those together, we had hoped to sort of explore some of the promise and limits of those two originally geographic formulations by freeing them from their assumed maps, you could say.
Yeah, and as we came to UCHRI in the fall, we started off by thinking about three broad problems that we wanted to engage with this interdisciplinary group of scholars. The first was how to think about alternative politics, theories, possibilities in the context of the absence of socialism as a sort of ethical limit to global capitalism. The second is the question of temporality that post-socialism raises, which is thinking about history differently, thinking about possibilities that are ongoing or foreclosed in terms of socialist imaginaries. And finally, we wanted to, as Kalindi mentioned, sort of unmoor post-socialism and post-colonialism for very particular geographic associations or even historical associations. The China scholars in our group, for example, often talk about post-socialism in China, for instance, starting in the late 70s or 1980, not 1989. And so in that sense, whereas we can think about area studies as a Cold War knowledge formation, we were interested in sort of rethinking the possibilities for transnational analytics in the current context.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a sense in which, I think, as you put it in your initial formulation, the posts in each of these instances sort of map onto the post-colonial, map onto the, even as it takes it in a slightly different direction, right? So both socialism and post-imperialism. And I mean, there's the Soviet imperial context, right? So sort of the devolution of the East European sort of imperial space, and indeed the globalizations that were attached to that, right? The sort of post-socialist in the context of the Chinese, and the globalizations that are attached to that, and then of course the American context, which is, some would argue not quite post-imperialist, but certainly expressing forms of globalization that are, if associated with, yet different from the other two. So it speaks to the ways in which there are generalizations, I think, that to which you're attending, even as their specificities related to the particular contexts. So can you talk a little bit about the context that each of you individually are interested in, Eastern Europe in the one context and India in the other, and then maybe some of the other contexts that have come out of the group, right?
Sure. Well, one of the exciting things that has come out of the group in relevance to my work is, and I think this is for many of us, is by bracketing the idea of the post temporarily and focusing on the idea of legacies, it gives me and others an opportunity to think about state socialism as one thing, but also ongoing socialist projects as another. And so in India, there was never a formal state socialist government in the way there was in the Soviet Union. However, there were very active engagements with socialism through the state government, and still are, in fact. There's, as many people know, a Maoist movement still active in India, as well as state communist governments, provincial communist governments. And so for me, it was a way to think about, because India is somewhat overdetermined as a site of post-colonial studies, it was a way to refresh and re-engage with some of the contemporary issues involved that have been pointed out, say, by subaltern studies theorists, and thinking about a new imagination of publics, also of individual and group collective actions, political actions. And these are questions that are articulated very well with many people in the group. And if you want, I can go through the sort of three major themes that have emerged in the group after Neda talks about her work, or you can too.
Well, it's interesting that you mention U.S. imperialism. My work actually engages Eastern Europe and the U.S. imaginary through the problem of the form that U.S. imperialism has taken, particularly humanitarian imperialism, and vis-a-vis the former Yugoslavia. I actually think that post-socialist analytic provides a really interesting opportunity to think about the way that difference gets used in the enactment of U.S. imperialism. And I'm particularly interested in the reformulation of languages about race and modes of racialization that humanitarian imperialism has enacted. In terms of the work of the group, one of the major themes that emerged that relates to my work is the question of difference in the post-socialist context. And but you had wanted to talk about the
general themes. Yeah, so what we've kind of come to as a resting point at the end of the group and hope to carry forward is a set of three kind of loosely formulated problems, one of which is a question of how engaging with temporality as a framework allows us to rethink some of the problems people have had in comparative studies of difference. So how do you talk about racial difference across nationalist contexts? Or how do you talk about the ways that, for example, we read Chandan Reddy's recent book, and we used his model of thinking about how in the US context, juridically, new group identities based on categories of difference, and in his book he's talking about sexuality, get framed as amendments to already existing modes of juridical recognition. And so how do we escape this recapitulation of already existing modes of recognition that then enhance the organization and power of the state as it exists? And so one of the ways we've been doing that is thinking about temporality, and maybe Neda can give some examples of how people have done that. Another is actually thinking about how the so-called failure of Marxist humanism as a governmental model has caused a sort of crisis in various leftist movements around the world in terms of what is the model for political change or revolution. And this is something that we've been talking about in really interesting ways in the group. Are there still, as people will say, there are still revolutions. It's not that there's not existing models of revolution, but there are also other interesting modes of looking for political projects and subjects. And, for example, we've talked about how internet technologies have allowed for different kinds of mobilizations politically, such as the Occupy movement. And all of this we see as tied into the project of the group. And then finally, to go back to your original question of how these different sites with their engagements with socialism and imperialism produce globalizations in the plural that often get overwritten through a logic of neoliberalism. And so part of the third kind of theme that's come out is how to make that critique that often gets housed in a neoliberal frame more specific, more particular.
It's true. So often the readings that we did about post-socialism just slip into talking about neoliberalism. And so it's something that
it's interesting. I mean, the way in which generally categories get reduced to the conditions of possibility posed by existing categorical formulations, right? So it's actually a deep dilemma. You think in terms of civil rights considerations or anti-apartheid considerations, that one is bound to invoke the very terms of subjugation in order to resist them or in order to indicate what it is one's against. And in doing that, one then sort of ratifies the very categories, right? That it's necessary to invoke in order to resist. It is a deep dilemma. I was interested in the point you were making about how one speaks about different formulations, say in cross-national in relation to race. I mean, on the one hand, in dominant racial work, the dominant way, sort of methodologically, in which to do that has been comparativist, right? So, but when one does that, the dominant national formulations are the U.S., Brazil, South Africa, maybe Britain. So it's again and again there are these comparativist studies, whether it's the early ones, Carl Degler or Pierre van den Berg, and the more recent ones in Anthony Marx or somebody like that. And the poverty of that is it takes as given, right, the set national formulations, right, and they're discrete, they're sort of siloed in some sense. So I've thought long and hard about a different kind of methodological model, which I call relational, right? Sort of, it's not that these things don't influence each other, and the influences, ideas travel, right? They're circuits, they go back and forth, and they're influencing each other in different modes. So you get a different prism into things when you think relationally, even in the historical context, than if you think comparativistically, where it's fixed and cemented and siloed. So I wonder. I mean, I can surmise that there's a comparable set of considerations in relation to, say, socialisms, for instance, right? So where you're taking socialism in one country, which isn't socialism in another country, but when you actually, there it seems absolutely obvious that there were mutual influences running in various directions. I think of Eurocommunism at a certain point, influenced by communisms elsewhere, right? So.
Yeah.
And it was, I would say there were two, in terms of socialism, there were two parallel conversations happening. One was, how do we rethink difference in race relationally if we think about post-socialism as an analytic? And in that context, something that often came up was the place of Eastern Europe as a place that's sort of in the shadows. So it's part of Europe, but not quite, but it doesn't quite fit the pre-existing ways of thinking about difference, right? And so this is one way that we talked about it. But another way, we also did talk about, what happens if we think about multiple post-socialism. And actually, one of the fellows in the group just today was talking about how if we think about multiple post-socialisms, thinking about different moments in which we can think about post-socialism beginning, how does that then allow us to rethink foreclosed possibilities? And I know you wanted to say more about...
Well, I was thinking about another scholar in the group who is working on thinking about difference produced by the historical relationship to Soviet imperialism of an Eastern European nation, and articulating an almost, you could say, an affectively experienced sense of difference, ways of being in the world that constantly announce themselves as difference but don't articulate as race because of the dominance of racial discourse as being either phenotypical or ethnic in some way, and how even in her context, ethnicity doesn't work as a way to mark difference. And so there are these, several people in the group who are thinking about the problems represented by the study of racial discourse or racialization, or as Denise De Silva says, raciality, but in terms of manners or inherited categories of being that don't actually fit into even a U.S. sort of transnational ethnic studies model, even a relational model necessarily. And so, for example, she talks about how to think about various affective experiences like bewilderment in the face of different modes of historical being that don't stay in their proper temporal order. So this is why I think in some ways temporality has been a really interesting point for which people in the group are thinking about difference. And it helps you in some ways escape some of the dilemmas of this, what I said Chandan Reddy calls an amendment relationship to recognizing difference. But I'm sure it has limitations as well. We're just sort of
But it's
exploring.
a crucial question if we think about the contemporary imperial formations and contemporary modes of, for example, racializing Islam, right? I think it points to a need to sort of rethink how we talk about processes of race and racialization. And so I think for us, these conversations about places or subjects that don't quite fit the existing ways of thinking and theorizing difference is a really important place.
There's a way, Emma McClintock made the point about the post-colonial, and people have picked up in other contexts that the post-colonial is not the aftermath of the colonial or the ending of the colonial, but a different way in which the colonial is played and lived out, right? Politico-economically, affectively, legally, and so on and so forth. And one can make the same point about race. That the post-racial is not the end of race, right? As some have, somewhat too quickly declared. But the post-racial is another way in which the racial is, or racialities, or the raciological is expressed, and there's a way in which you can think of the post-social as or post-socialist, both. Different, right? The post-social is different than the post-socialist, obviously, but how they are different formulations, different expressive modalities in terms of which these things take on new life.
Absolutely.
And it seems that this is, in an extended sense, what the group has been.
Absolutely. What is added to the previous mapping of race and in terms of bodies and continents, what is added when we now also have the racialization of ideological formations, when we have the racialization of religion, when we have even the racialization of anachronistic belief systems, right, that don't fit the liberal democratic model in which we're all supposed to be now in the post-socialist moment.
Well, great. And we look forward to continued work on the part of both of you and the group together, and look forward to further engagements and conversations. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.